Okay, so here we are in the Book of Ruth again. We're going to be in chapter 1, verses 16 through 22. And just by way of review, we've discovered the names of the characters involved in this book. Elimelech is easy, El for God, and Melech for king. So his name is God as king. His sons Chilion and Mahlon, I have sort of used the alternate meanings of their names, song and satisfaction. Naomi, of course, is the word for sweet or pleasant, and Ruth is commonly translated as friend. Bethlehem, Judah, is the house of bread and thankfulness or praise. So, God is king with his sweet and pleasant wife, and his children, song and satisfaction, left the house of praise and bread to sojourn in Moab, a place born in darkness of incest. They left due to a famine, which Leviticus 26 and about 100 other places might tell you that is caused by a famine of faith. It doesn't say that directly, but I think we can assume the famine of food is somewhat caused by either a personal famine of faith or possibly a famine of faith of all the people. Using his best judgment, God as king took his family out of God's house looking for food rather than drawing closer to God and staying with God. And you might just contrast that to Jacob, who, when faced with a famine of food, he stayed put but sent for takeout to Egypt. The sojourn of Elimelech and Naomi and Chilion and Mahlon turned into the word continued, which then turned into the word dwell. And we see that same sort of thing in Psalm 1, where he talks about walking, standing, and sitting to indicate one that is not like a tree planted firmly by the river of water. God is king, song, and satisfaction all died in Moab, and that's always the case from the garden on. While still in the darkness of Moab, Naomi then hears God visited the people, and Shub, or returns home. Think of the prodigal son returning home to the father. And it's interesting, of course, that even in the darkness of the land of Moab, even after she's lost her husband and her sons, she still hears God. So that brings us to where we are tonight. We're going to start in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 14, and it reads like this. And they lifted up their voice, and they would be the two daughters-in-law, and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. And, when we started this, I was going to tell you I was try to use more darash, more of the application. So here goes. Mark 4 is the parable of the sower that we all know, and there's 4 types of people in there. And I might suggest that Orpah could represent the type of person who receives the message with great joy, practically gushes about how wonderful and meaningful it is, but then you don't see him at church anymore. They seem to be without apparent roots, and the meaningful message is useless. They're very emotional, always wanting to be involved, but with no roots, they soon wither away. Orpah kissed Naomi and wept with her, and she was very emotional about the whole deal, but was easily swayed. Naomi had given her some legitimate and logistical concrete reasons why she might want to return, and she did. She took those reasons and returned. Ruth was not that way. Orpah is like the seed without the root. It springs up rapidly and fades just as quickly. Sort of like those moved to go forward at a crusade. It's exciting. You're in the stadium, all good music, and the message is great. It all sounds true, and they make the effort and go down and receive the Lord, but often the flame dies as rapidly as it was lit. Okay, verse 15, chapter 1, Book of Ruth. And she said, and this would be Naomi. And Naomi said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and gone to her gods. Return thou after your sister-in-law. Ruth, on the other hand, represents that seed who grows and bears fruit. She was not swayed by a good argument. Her roots were strong. She might represent one of the 3% or so that go forward at a crusade and are actually saved, that you do see back at church and that do show evidence of the Lord in their life. Okay, verse 16, chapter 1, Book of Ruth. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whether thou goest, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and my God, or your God shall be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death part thee and me. That's one of the greatest verses in Scripture, I think. It's sort of the Tanakh version of the Torah message when we saw Rivka was asked if she would go with this man, and she said, I will go. Each of us at one time or another has had to make that same profession. Unfortunately, many are like Orpah, not Oprah, well, maybe Oprah, and fade away. But some are like Ruth, strong and sure in their faith. Verse 18, and when she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, she left off speaking to her. Steadfastly minded is that word we've looked at before, amatz, and it's from the root mem sade, and it means strong, squeeze. It's also translated as strong, courageous, courage, harden, fortify, increase, and about 40 other things. So you kind of get the impression that Ruth was set to go. She was on the way to Bethlehem. Ruth the widow was determined to go to Bethlehem. So I want to read part of Isaiah 54. It offers a little insight on this, but you might want to read the whole chapter as homework. 54 verse 1 begins this way. Sing, O barren, thou that did not bear, break forth into singing and cry aloud, thou that did not travail with child, for more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, saith Yahweh. Enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth the curtains of thy habitation. Spare not, and lengthen the cords, and strengthen thy stakes. For thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles, and make desolate the cities to be inhabited. Make the desolate cities to be inhabited. Fear not, for thou shalt not be ashamed, and neither be confounded. For thou shalt not be put to shame, for thou shalt not remember the reproach of thy widowhood any more. And I might suggest that Ruth is a picture, perhaps the best picture of this section in Isaiah 54 in general. Naomi will soon say, call me Mara, bitter. I went out full and came back empty. Really? She went out with a family who choose to leave the house of bread and the place of peace and the house of praise. The fullness, they went with names like God is King, Song, and Satisfaction, but they chose to leave the things of Yahweh. We've already looked in Leviticus 26 and learned that a famine of food is often caused by the famine of faith, when the Lord shuts up the rain and there's no more food, but it is caused by the people not following after the Lord. Naomi claims she left full, but I might suggest she left with something like a great program or ministry, an awesome speaker, or a huge building perhaps. In reality, she left with nothing and came back with Ruth, a Gentile who had chosen to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I might say she went out empty and came back full. Remember in the book of Revelation, the city of Smyrna was thought they were poor, but Yahweh pronounced them rich. On the other hand, Laodicea thought they were rich, but Yahweh saw them as poor, blind, naked, and miserable. When we judge things through our eyes, we don't often get it right. I don't think Yahweh thought that Naomi was returning empty. Indeed, she was returning with the seed of Jesus. Don't judge our spiritual success by man's scoreboard. Okay, verse 19. And so the two went until they came to Bethlehem. And it came to pass, when they were come to Bethlehem, that all the city was moved about them, and said, Is this Naomi? Is this sweet and pleasant? Where is God the King? Where is song and satisfaction? What has happened? As the world looked at her, it might have seemed like she had indeed lost everything. And from our vantage point in history now, we can see that she actually gained everything. But often when we have tribulation, we don't see God's hands in our circumstances. Often we won't see it for many years, decades even sometimes. But that's what faith is trusting that God does see it and God does have a plan. And what seemed to Naomi to be leaving full and returning empty, I think was exactly the opposite. This is probably one of the best cases in Scripture of God bringing beauty from ashes. But Naomi will not see it for a while. In some ways, Ruth is a little like Esther, Joseph, Moses, Abraham, Mary, some of those other people that we've talked about, that people who God used in often circumstances that they didn't want to be in, but he used them to save all Israel. There was always a plan. To say that your circumstance is not God using it to work amazing things. How do you know? Certainly Joseph had to question that many times with his 30 some years in prison, and you know the story of Joseph. And yet he believed in his heart that God was using it, and God did use it, and God did use it to save all of Israel. I believe that most of our tribulation that we experience is probably self-inflicted. I tend to believe that Elimelech's tribulation was mostly self-inflicted. He did not trust Yahweh, but instead to fix out the problem himself, rather than returning to God. He did exactly what we would do. Faced with a situation, we do our best to figure out how best to get out of it, when often, I think, if we would just spend the time in prayer, we might come to a different conclusion. But if Elimelech wound up in Moab because his personal famine of faith, or if it was God prodding him directly to make the move, we don't really know. And it doesn't really matter, because God used the situation to bring this beautiful picture and entire lesson to the world for all time. But don't discount your tribulation. You could be like Naomi and believe that God is against you. You may feel like God is against you. It may look like God is against you. And it is even possible that God might be against you. But he always figures out a way to use it for his glory. Joseph and Naomi both wound up blessing the Lord for his goodness when they came to see the entire picture. And my suggestion is so that we will too, when we find ourselves in a tribulation, thinking God is against us, thinking he's forgotten us, thinking whatever the things are that we think. If we just realize, if we just look back at our own personal history and the personal histories of the people in Scripture, we know that's not true. He doesn't forget about us. He doesn't punish us like that. Okay, back to the verses. Verse 20. And she said unto them, call me, said unto them, being the people in Jerusalem who just saw her return, she said unto them, call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Lord hath dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why then call me Naomi, seeing that the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And of course, as we talked before, the barley harvest, the barley is the common man's grain. It speaks of, well, perhaps people like you and me. It's not the rich man's grain like the wheat is, and it's not a coincidence that this came at the beginning of the barley harvest. And there's actually two barley harvests. The first one we find around the time of Passover, and the second one we find around the time of Pentecost. I suspect this is the first barley harvest, which would put it around the time of the Passover. So in this country and many other countries, a non-citizen can become a citizen simply by marrying another citizen. Most countries recognize that bond, one of joining themselves one to another, to become like each other. They are not two separate anymore. They're one. They're married. That's the very picture of being married in Scripture. We see this many times in Scripture as a foreigner joins themselves to the people of God, people of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They become like the other. Paul has much to say about that in many places, including Romans chapter 11, where he talks about the wild olive tree and the natural olive tree and all the breaking of branches and the grafting, and we've looked at this pretty extensively, how he makes two into one. He cannot mix. He doesn't have two separate things. He doesn't say both them and us, or both the Jew and the Gentile, or both the young and the old, or whatever it is. He makes them all one. So if we step back a ways and look at this larger picture, we already know how this lesson ends. We've read the book of Ruth. But look at Ruth the Gentile as representing us. She was drawn to Naomi. And the Jews, represented by Naomi, was sort of drawn to the Gentiles. Naomi was sweet and pleasant, and her children's song and satisfaction, and her husband, God, is king. Even the conditions of their visit seemed to draw one to the other. And I suspect it brought something different into the life of Ruth and Orpah. They saw something in these Jews that perhaps they were unfamiliar with in their home country and culture of Moab, and it drew them to the Jews. I might suggest that even in their condition of fleeing a famine of food or faith, probably both, they offered something to Ruth that she had not experienced before. She was drawn to them just as they were drawn to her. The Gentile drawn to the Jew, and the Jew drawn to the Gentile. While Naomi was full in her words, and everything was good, the Gentiles were content to live under the cover of the Jews, even in a pagan land. But as the things deteriorated with the Jew, the Gentile moved to the fore. It was Ruth who went to to Bethlehem. She wanted to go back. It's interesting if we look at, Romans chapter 11 again, how that works about the Gentiles being grafted onto the natural olive tree. And this is exactly the picture we see in this book. I think that, we know from Romans and several other places that one of the things the Gentiles do is to make the Jews jealous to return to their own God. They will see that we've been drawn to the God that they grew up with, and they will become jealous and draw closer to that God. And that's exactly what we see in the book of Ruth. I think in every case, salvation comes when we go from darkness to light. In the case of a Gentile, that probably means something like coming out of Moab or of the Chaldees like Abraham did, into the light of the children of the people of Israel. But for the Jew, sometimes that means leaving the light and going into the darkness to be returned into the light. Now, as we look at Ruth, we might make the case that Ruth was not really saved until Naomi was humbled. Not because Naomi was humbled, not because she was humbled, but in the effort to return Naomi to the place of peace with God, Ruth provided the strength to get back to Bethlehem. Certainly Ruth was drawn to Naomi's family while things were good, and they were no doubt, as their name suggested, pleasant, sweet song, satisfaction, God is King. It probably was good, and who would not be drawn to that? But it's not difficult to belong to God while things are good. The rubber meets the road when things are bad. The Gentiles come out of darkness into the light. The Jews go into the darkness that they may come again into the light. Paul in 2 Corinthians 4:7, and again, this is another chapter you might want to read and put in the context of the book of Ruth. But verse 7 says, "But we have this treasure in earthen vessels," and that treasure is Jesus, "that the excellency of power may be of God and not of us." We know that, but sometimes I think that earthen vessel, as Paul describes it, maybe we paint and shine up, and it becomes more like the ministry or the big church or the things that we focus on, that great pastor or that great sermon. And sometimes I think it's possible to miss Yahweh inside of it. In verse 6 of this same chapter in 2 Corinthians, Paul describes Jesus, Yeshua, as the light that shines out into the darkness. Sometimes we need to make sure that we're not concentrating on the vessel, we're concentrating on the light that's within the vessel. And it's almost as though Ruth could see that and Naomi lost sight of it. So we're going to begin to look at the new section of Scripture in chapter 2. Archbishop Langston got this one right. This is exactly where the chapter should be. Naomi and Ruth together are going to head off to Bethlehem, and we're going to learn a lot more certainly about Ruth, the Gentiles, about Naomi, the Jews, about Boaz, the kinsman redeemer, but we're going to learn a lot more about us. And we'll pick it up again next week.